So fantastic to have you with us, Amy. Thanks for joining the show.
Thank you. I'm super excited.
Yeah, good. Me too. So let's start with a bit of an introduction, if that's okay. So could you share a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Ever since I can remember, I've been fascinated by brains. I'm not entirely sure how it started, but I remember one holiday when I was about 15 taking a suitcase full of about 13 different books that had been recently published and just being amazed at how incredible this organ was. Fast forward, I went off to medical school thinking that that was how I would help people and learn more about how we worked. But obviously, with medical school, I'm very grateful for those that continue. We're looking at the problems and the things that go wrong in humans all of the time. And I'd started to see a bit at my father's law firm how these really smart, bright people who could do such great work often weren't as fulfilled as they could be, weren't as engaged, just weren't working in wise ways from what I'd understood about how our brains worked. And then I started to look outside of medicine and realize that there was all these different worlds out there where people really need to use their brains to the best of their abilities. And the way things were structured just didn't seem to honor how our brains work. So came out of medical school, was young, inexperienced, so set up a company because no one would employ me at that point on my campaign of we need to understand how brains work. And so I've been doing it ever since and just see this gap of if we understood more of how this organ worked and we created organizations that honor how it worked, then we'd be in a better position.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you for that. That's really interesting. That you wanted to flip to the positive side, as you say, rather than just fixing the problems that can come about. So what?
Yeah, I think it's important.
Yeah, what's if we dive straight in, then what's one of the biggest misconceptions you think that typical L&D teams or L&D professionals might hold about the brain that you'd love to just bust and they can let go of?
I think it's that once someone has learnt something, they'll use it
Mm.
or they'll do it. And I see this everywhere. So long as we can teach them this thing, then they'll change their behaviour. And the two are really quite independent.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I think that it's kind of like job done, isn't it? If you've you think you've done the kind of teaching or the training part, but really all you've done is perhaps give someone the opportunity to then do something with it or not.
Yeah, and just the knowledge to action gap is huge, and we've all experienced that. So we need to build differently to honour that.
Okay, great. So if you get all L&D leaders to make a kind of big, powerful change, based on neuroscience, what would you plead with them to do, or what would you wish that they could change?
I think it's to activate the reward network first before doing anything else. So, how are we turning on curiosity or anticipation or the what's in it for me so that our brain states are different before we then engage with anything?
Okay, great. Well, maybe we can dive into a little bit more about the reward network as we talk through the podcast. And I guess, again, if you could improve one thing about workplace learning, maybe in addition to that, then what would you pick and why?
It's linked to that. So I know you sort of wrestled with memory or motivation, and for me, engagement is the most impactful opportunity we've got, and it's often harder, partly because we're all different, but partly because it just takes a little bit more wrestling and potentially a bit more scaffolding. But motivation is so transient, memory doesn't necessarily lead to behavior change. So engagement opens the door for a lot more.
Okay, interesting. Can I ask a question about that as a follow-up then?
Mm.
So when I think of engagement, I think that, in theory, like somebody's switched on, they might be motivated, they're leaning into what's happening around them. Does it mean the same thing to you? Like, how would you explain it from a kind of neuroscience point of view?
That's a great question. So I wrote a whole book on this because when I was looking at a lot of the challenges in organisation and a lot of leaders are asking for dialing up motivation, the engaged state in the brain is one where typically the reward network is activated or has been activated. And as you described, what we'd see is someone leaning in, curious, present. But the cognitive benefits are that, yes, our attention will increase, potentially our retention could increase. We're likely to reinforce the new behaviours more effectively. So the whole cascade of opportunities you've got when someone is engaged rather than less engaged are really beneficial.
It's interesting because I think some people, because I'm a big fan of engagement, right? And also because I straddle between sort of marketing and learning. So I get the power of engagement. You can't, nothing's going to happen unless you have that. But some people who work in L&D can kind of maybe downplay the importance of it because obviously it's not the end goal. Impact or conversion of that learning to action is more important. But presumably you can't get there unless you're engaged first.
Well, and this is where we get into the meaty stuff. It depends, I would say. So I'd say that there are two pathways to impact and whatever we're looking for to be different. And ideally, in our work, we try and utilize both pathways. So, could you bypass engagement? Yes, you could, but most approaches that are being taken require are going down that pathway that then do require the engagement or will be magnified if you do have the engagement. So I totally agree, engagement in and of itself isn't helpful, but I would say, what brain state do you need
Mm.
in order for the change that you're looking for if you're going down that route?
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, and I guess maybe you don't need to be. Could you be less engaged if you simply got given the answer or something to help you right there and then? You don't necessarily need to be uh, engaged with that if it's literally solving the problem that you have. Like, so I need to do X. Oh, here's the answer. Off I go. You know.
Absolutely. Yeah. Then low level, because almost the engagement, the state that you'll be in with the answer will enable you to then enact it. If you were searching for the question, then you've already got curiosity. So I would say you probably have got what could be considered an engaged brain state.
Mm.
The fact that you're asking the question, if you've constructed the question, if you've got no interest in the question, then are you going to suddenly have any interest in the answer?
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, a magic resource lands in your lap, but you don't need it right there and then. You haven't even thought about it. You haven't asked the question. Then, of course, it's completely useless. In theory, yeah. Okay, that's interesting. And yeah, sorry, I made you dive in quickly, but it was an interesting
I love it.
conversation. So, if we stick with that topic then of how we move from engagement, if you presumably need it first, to learning transfer, to how to create action. How do you think L&D teams could use neuroscience insights to help make that conversion into action and make it kind of stick? And it's often a kind of cultural or organization kind of conversation too, but you can start with an individual learner if that's easier.
Yeah. So I think that when we're talking about stickiness, then yes, there are things to lean into, to pay attention to, but there's also the what are we trying to do here? Why do we need it to stick in the first place? And that, I think, sometimes we should flush out. Do we need someone to learn something, to have cognitive awareness of something, or do we need someone to do something differently? And it might mean that you need both,
Mm.
which normally we'd recommend if possible. But sometimes you can just nudge towards the behavior change, or even potentially the mind frame change that then could do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. But in terms of some of the stickiness underpinnings, you've got Hebbian learning, so our neural networks structurally change, physically change, and the more, we'd call it myelinated neural pathways, will be defaulted to. And so thinking again, taking a step back and looking at, well, how are we creating these stronger neural networks? What are the default behaviors? They say, don't they, when someone joins an organization, you can give them the handbook and all of the policies, but actually they'll look around and see what other people are doing, and that's what then they'll end up doing. And that will then be reinforced. I got consolidation, hugely important. It's brilliant in recent years that more people have been aware of the benefits of sleep. Who knew something we've been doing for millennia was important? And then suddenly we stop doing it quite so much and suddenly see some negative impacts. the sleep, the rest, the reflection. A lot of organizations report that there just isn't space for reflection, or people don't see the value in reflecting. And it's the same with, retrieval rather than rereading something that can be taught in schools and is taught in my daughter's school, which is brilliant. But we've got the research for that. We've got the evidence base that says, look, we need to be doing these things in order to make stuff stickier. But has that translated through to learning design all the time? I'm not sure. I think we still certainly get the invitation to support organisations around creating new playbooks or new videos, and we're happy to do that. And I think the novelty value of teaching people about how their brain works when they don't necessarily know that much about it is a good hook to bring people in. But then we're always encouraging them to think about how you can co-create the solutions with people, because the engagement and the impact you get is far greater from people who know the problems much more deeply. It can be more difficult to do. I grant people that. It's newer as an approach, and so people can be a little bit more wary of that. But even something like storytelling, we know how impactful it can be. But I've even seen storytelling be a little bit blurred recently. Some people will say, oh, here we're doing some storytelling, but really it's just sort of an explanation of what someone's going to cover at a conference. It's not really a story. And if you look at the neuroscience of storytelling, the transportation element is hugely important. And so again, scaffolding within any L&D type interventions, what stories are we telling? How are they going to influence people? How is this going to make the new normal stick and more attractive than the last? Another big impactor is the social connectivity. We know humans hugely influenced by others. How can we capitalize on that? How can we make sure that that's built in, so we're not just telling people to do something, but they are talking to one another and creating that? And it links to AI, which I know we might talk about later, but the impact of the human versus other approaches. Another big thing, the organizations are asking us for more and more, which is really exciting that they're seeing the challenge, is actually, rather than to load more on, is they're aware that the cognitive load of their people is huge, and so actually wanting help to simplify. What can we get rid of? What can we just focus on to enable people to be super clear? And the evidence bears that out, that actually, rather than just a wash of interesting information, what specifically are we asking people to do, and super specific. And we can talk more, but we take a cross-training type approach to this. So if we understand the brain networks that lead to a range of different skills, then if we strengthen one network, we could get 5 or 6 different skill-based benefits. But if we focus just on the skill, like do this, do this, do this, then we might not get the reverse. But yeah, I guess a summary would be inviting people to run experiments internally to increase stickiness. And that's great from a mind frame perspective, because people have got less threat response when they're engaging with an experiment. And you can empower the people that are actually doing the doing to own what are we going to experiment with. Now, how does that land?
That all sounds absolutely amazing, but it also makes me think how much it goes obviously well beyond what we think of as kind of learning in a formal way, right? Because it's a lot to do with how people what their work lives are like. So if there is no space for reflection, that's not necessarily always an L&D problem or a learning problem, is it? That's actually, reflectivity, whether you think you're involved with formal or active learning, can help you with any job task, any kind of problem, like sleep can. So if your work diary is action-packed and you're hopping from meeting to meeting to meeting, and then you have 1 hour a week for some learning, still with no reflection built in, then you're going to struggle, aren't you? So it kind of does relate to that kind of cultural, organizational behaviors, doesn't it? Same with collaboration and co-work. If it's not part of your culture, then it's a challenge, isn't it? Then for like learning teams to then wheel that out and say, build this into your practice.
100%. I think often the best thing that L&D individuals can do is to equip the senior leaders to understand how people will work best. I'd say the majority of our work now is with those senior leaders to redesign how things are set up, because you can't expect people to change. Everyone says we live in a time of constant change now, and I go, okay, but what are you dropping? Like, change is an effortful process. It takes cognitive bandwidth. So what are we getting rid of so that they've got this bandwidth, so that they can redesign wisely for this next phase? And often that hasn't been thought through, but we will not get the best from people. We'll stumble into things like we stumbled into hybrid working that had real potential to be amazing, but a lot of people's experience was it was substandard. And there's so many things that we just sort of stumble into and we're doing without actually looking at how can this work well. So yeah, I love your suggestions of making sure that almost everyone's on the same page, we're aligned, and we know how people can work well, not just how they can learn well.
Yeah, because in theory we should be learning every day, as we're going along, right? And that's what makes humans kind of great and interesting, is that we have that ability, if only given the kind of, I guess, circumstances and the opportunities, I guess, to do so around us. We
Yeah.
might get into it later, but you talked about skills in your explanation a moment ago, and I think you were saying, and you can correct me here, that if you look at the connectivity between like skills that are like each other and start to look at those first, then you're more likely to develop other skills. I might be misinterpreting that, but I guess my question is there a risk as we train for skills, which is a rising focus now in organizations to look at skills and skills gaps, that we look at them in an isolated context and don't allow for that connectivity that we need as humans, or maybe the brain needs to develop that learning? So you can correct me first if I'm wrong in my interpretation, and then we can
Yes.
focus on that
No.
question.
No, I think I'm there, and I agree there is a risk, and I would be very wary of, almost, on Friday you're going to learn this skill, but that's all you're going to do in terms of learning this week. It's utterly crazy, but I think it's again part of the ecosystem of challenge that's no individual's fault. We're not looking to blame anyone, but just the way things have evolved, everyone is so busy. And a lot of people are saying, well, when are you going to develop me? And I see this sometimes in the questions people are asked, how have you been developed? Are you satisfied with your development this year? And I think, what do you mean, be developed? And that comes, from, I guess, a place of self-studying for many, many years. And, even if you go to a medical school lecture, you get the paperwork, which is these lecture notes, and then pretty much your tutor will read their notes to you that are also replicated on the board behind them. So in terms of being taught, it's you really have to learn. You can't just expect passively to take this stuff. And my concern, if we were going to ring fence skills too much, is that we don't then get that cross connectivity. I could see there being value, and I don't know as much about it as you or others, but I could see there being opportunity. We chunk up and we go, right, well, what do the different networks in the brain do? And, so if we're looking to manage people or lead people, then we need a decent social emotional type network. There's a whole bunch of skills that stem from being able to emotionally regulate, being able to inspire and engage others, and all of these different things. So if we focus on strengthening that network, then you'd probably get all of those skills. But if you just focus on the one skill, you might get a bit of improvement in the network, but you could probably do better with the time you've got. And when people are time pressured, that seems like a sensible thing to do. So yeah, cross training for the brain where possible, we would recommend.
And focusing on those kind of foundational building blocks, I guess, that then can feed in and serve other areas of skill.
Exactly, and that then's beneficial because we don't know what the future holds. So for in the next 5 years, when all of these new skills are suddenly required, but it does tickle me sometimes in that the skills, and I don't know whether these would be considered skills in your world, but things like resilience. We've been teaching about how resilience is important for decades, and then the pandemic hit, and suddenly everyone, we need resilience training. Quick, let's make everyone resilient. And I was like, no, it's too late now. Now they're stressed. Now we need to manage stress, not try and make people resilient at a time of real change and challenge. It's completely illogical. And so we want to train people now and embed these different ways of being and doing, so that we're future ready, so that whatever happens next, whatever the next lot of skills are that are needed, we've got that capability there.
Yeah, I guess what's happening now is a lot of people are saying, for example, with AI making the advances that it is like we really need to develop critical thinking. It's like, well, brilliant. Did that start, maybe at the age of 2, 3 and onwards, kind of through school and beyond? Or if it's a panic to suddenly be like, well, let's develop a course. I don't know how you would do a course on critical thinking, as a kind of module, that just, to me, that doesn't make sense. It's got to build up through your life. I'm not saying we can't start now, but it's not a once and done kind of skill, is it? You can't just overnight. I've nailed it 100%. I've got 100% of my critical thinking. Off I
Yeah.
go.
No, I mean, that really is misguided, isn't it? You can get 100% on anything and still not then be any good at it in terms of knowing how to do it. The yeah, the challenge with I would say a lot of skills is, I mean, Hebbian learning teaches us use it or lose it. So if you're not, once you've made those neural pathways, so if you've demonstrated you can do critical thinking, that's great and that's a start, but then you need to keep up that ability, and we need to be sensitive to the environments that we're in. For example, I used to be great at critical thinking. When I had my daughter years ago and was sleep deprived for 3 years, my ability to critically think went through the floor, as did a lot of other abilities. And so being aware of the context and making sure that we're not just saying, right, everyone's got critical thinking next. The context that people are in will influence whether a skill flourishes or dries out.
Like your pandemic example, I guess, high stress, does it naturally suddenly draw out resilience if you haven't built that skill in the first place? But you get that kind of fight or flight, kind of reactions kind of going on, don't you, with in high stress? Yeah, so I appreciate what you're saying about, I've also had children and mass sleep deprivation, the moments we try to put the kettle in the fridge. However, time management, that definitely increased. That ability to compartmentalize, to organize, increased. But critical thinking in that moment, yeah, maybe slightly dipped. There, so I understand that.
Yeah. And I love that example, and it's so important to call out what grows even during times where things might be depleting. I've got a friend who has an autistic son, and she says, "Oh, I've been out of work for 6 years." I say, "Your skills to persuade, to invite in, to influence are far beyond what most people I know. You have to think on your feet, coach at a moment's notice. Your emotional regulation needs to be near perfect. The amount of skills she has built while being out of work are just incredible.
Yeah, it's the difference between paid and unpaid work, isn't it? I guess it's remembering
Absolutely.
it's all part of our lives. So I want to,
Yeah, one brain that we take all over
yeah,
the place.
exactly. And yeah, one story, isn't it? So constantly building story. I want to dive a little bit into talking about coaching with you, if that's okay. So obviously you've written a book on neuroscience for coaches, and you're looking at the science behind effective coaching. So what do you think, mostly people listening to this might work in kind of corporate L&D, for example, or be a learning expert in their own right. But how do you think, what is it about coaching that inspires you so much, and how does it impact the brain, I guess?
It's a wonderful question. So, because coaching occurs typically, although maybe changing, between two humans, the opportunity for shared attention, for emotional contagion or regulation is huge. And when someone is being coached, you're facilitating self directed neuroplasticity. And you can do through coaching what is far more difficult to do through other mediums. So I think it's quite special in that regard. So evidence base wise, the tailored nature of it is fantastic for change, and restructuring the brain essentially. The impact. So we've trained numerous organizations to upskill their managers in coaching skills, and they keep coming back and training more of their people, which tells me that it's benefiting people. And the approach we take, which I think is really key in coaching, it follows everything we've been talking about so far, but people need to practice it. There is no good at all that people just learn a lot of ways to coach and models to coach and tools to coach. They've actually got to do it. And I think people's experience often is, oh, but I really understood it when I read it in the book. Now I'm trying. It's a little bit harder. And it is, because humans are difficult and they don't follow exactly what we would like them to follow. And we have to think on our feet. So I think coaching is really nourishing and stretching and enriching for both the coach and the coachee. Some of the other benefits: you are less likely to be activating the threat response. You are more likely to be creating, we call it a high performing neural environment, but a internal space where people's brains can work well. And I imagine it's the same with the organizations you work with. There are so many super smart people out there that just need a few minutes to think, and they can solve huge numbers of problems, and they come up with so much better ways of doing things. And giving people that protected coaching time can enable them to just calm the doing enough that perhaps deeper regions in the brain can switch on and bring the insight up into their awareness, meaning the genius is within them, and we're just creating the space for the insight to come forth. So yeah, big fan of coaching.
So is that kind of bringing forth, or kind of tapping into the insights that people might have and maybe not realize they had, or other people might not realize they had? Is that through, for example, like coaching questioning techniques, bringing that out of them, or are we suggesting that they become the coaches?
So both, but predominantly when they're being coached, stopping doing, they are more likely to activate the default mode network. So they're more likely to go into mind wandering, meaning that they're more likely to make lateral connections and then bring them together, become aware of them, and then they've got an opportunity to enact them. But so much, I think, of challenge we see in organizations, rather than throw another course at it, give them space to think about how to overcome the challenge. And it might then be that insights need to go further up, and structures need to change, policies, procedures, approaches, the working environment needs to change. But often there will be things that they can own, and because they've come to the realization themselves, it's automatically going to be more likely that they will own it and want to run forward with it to enact it. So yeah, the insight is really key and a big benefit of coaching. And you could get a degree of that without another party present, but that shared attention, someone else being humanly present, seems to change how the brain works, and offer certain benefits, makes it more memorable, whatever they're coming up with. You potentially have got the accountability component, and that time, will they take the time if it's just scheduled in as reflection time rather than an appointment with another human? But equally, it might be that the coach asks a wonderful question that stimulates some thinking that they wouldn't have stimulated themselves. Was it Einstein who said the brain that constructs the problem can't come up with the answer? I'm not sure I fully agree, but I think having different stimulus and different questions can certainly be beneficial.
Yeah, that's interesting. And we already talked about how the reflection is so important, but how it's also a challenge, often kind of culturally, to have that in your diary. And even the idea of putting a fixed set time for you to reflect, without someone else being there to prompt you, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen, because it might depend on all sorts of things that are going on for you at that point in time. We talked about context and kind of what's happening in your world at that moment. So yeah, that's interesting.
A lot of leaders, though, I think do this. A lot of the great leaders I've met have got some way of doing either being coached and
Mm.
having that input, or at the very least have some sort of, they'd normally class it as a hobby. It might be that they get up and run before work. It might be that at lunchtime they go for a walk. But I've noticed they seem to have some sort of behavior that basically will switch off their prefrontal cortex. It's not about uploading more data, but is enabling them to go into the default mode, and then insights will come to
Yeah.
them that way. So it's interesting that a lot of impressive people have worked a system out for creating space for this.
Yeah, we talk about that in our household. Actually, a good bike ride will often fix a problem that you've been niggling with or feeling overwhelmed by, maybe at work, and you'll come back and be like, "I've got it." I know exactly what
Yes.
I'm going to do, or I know what my next thing I'm going to ask myself is about that. Yeah. So, and probably there's some neuroscience around, maybe exercising and getting different chemicals going to kind of help that process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So you obviously do a lot of work with individuals and teams to help increase their abilities to coach and coach well. How obviously we can't kind of download that from you today in the podcast, unfortunately, and obviously that's what you do for your work. But what would you love for managers out there to be able to kind of do from a brain-based point of view, to be able to develop their coaching talents more effectively?
I think the first thing, or the biggest barrier we often see, is that for a long time people's value has been associated with what they know. And for coaching, we're asking them to switch that off. We're not asking them to give answers for a chunk of time. And that is, I would say, one of the biggest challenges for a lot of them to overcome. And so believing that actually your presence and your questions and your reflecting back to people what you're hearing could be a bigger gift to them than the answers that you've pre-constructed. But then, like, just getting out there and practicing. The more people practice and ideally get feedback, because obviously bad practice just makes you worse. But if you can get some feedback on your practice, even if you're just doing it from reading some books, watching some LinkedIn learning videos, whatever it might be, taking time then to just reflect, oh, how did that go? But ask people questions, and don't dress up your advice as questions. I've seen that done
Yeah.
as well. But just ask people questions and then reflect back what you're hearing and look for patterns. And I've new coaches, in my experience, often say, goodness me, it's a lot more tiring than I thought it would be. And it really is giving our attention. Our attention's a precious resource, and it is effortful when we are really being present and paying attention to another. But just doing those things, as a lot of good parents will do, and will be practiced at, being present, holding the space, listening, asking some questions, reflecting back perhaps what you hear. Again, it might be skills that people have learnt in other areas of life that can be applied in the management situation. You don't have to know all about how the brain works. The reason that we bring it, we offer it, is because it can stimulate different questions. So if you don't know anything about how the brain works, your thought train might go in one direction. If you've got a bit more of a wider appreciation of how the brain works, how different networks work, how different chemicals work, what different challenges, barriers could be, like cognitive load, then it might influence the questions that you're asking. But we're certainly not saying it's the only way. It's an additional lens to look through,
Mm.
and there are many.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks. So I wanted to ask you about the kind of rise of AI powered coaching, and that's been kind of, I guess, picked as kind of one of the key ways that AI might be used within a kind of learning context where it might have some strengths. Is a kind of talk of the town or talk of the internet. I wondered how you felt about that from a neuroscience point of view, and if you see benefits, or risks, or a bit of both.
Yeah, both for sure. So I am very positive about change and about technology. I'm also very positive about humans. And I think one of the mistakes we've made in the past is to not quite take enough of a step back and look at the bigger picture. And so certainly some bigger questions around AI uses, and because I hear the arguments for the short term and I can see the benefits, wonderful. But what about this, this, and this? And I'm like, oh, we haven't thought about that yet. And I think, oh my word, what's in store in the future? But that said, one of my pro using AI for coaching, there are some benefits and there are some situations where I think it can be really helpful. One of my concerns would be, I don't think we've got great evidence on this yet, but we do have evidence in other areas, from other areas of research, that when we trick the brain, it can sometimes have unintentional negative consequences, like artificial sweeteners. And I don't know if anyone's likened chat AI-powered coaching bots to artificial sweeteners yet, but for example, empathy, real empathy between humans, has a cost associated with it. At medical school, you're taught to, where possible, veer on the side of sympathy rather than empathy, because empathy can be draining. If you are constantly feeling what other people are feeling, that comes at a cost. And there has been some research that suggests that AIs can demonstrate empathy more effectively than humans, and it's not really empathy because the bot isn't feeling what we feel. So there's just some questions around that. What can it be good for? It can absolutely help with reinforcement, repetition. I can get it to extract information from me, help me reinforce things. Brilliant for kids as well as for adults, for different things that we might want to do. Low stake reflection, if I programmed it well, it could help me reflect. That could be useful. And it's very emotionally safe. So if I'm reflecting on something and sharing a lot of my shortcomings, the AI is not going to judge me. In a good coaching relationship, you wouldn't judge me either negatively, but that might be useful. And the scalability question, of course, yes, there are lots that could be served in this way. Some of the risks, and we've touched on this before, but the co-regulation, humans, and we don't know exactly how it all works. We know some of how it works, but I am convinced there's a lot more that we don't understand, but how the co-regulation process occurs. And there has been some research, even just this year, I think Passmore, Olson and T raised that there can be positive impacts of the bots, but the human coaches were stronger in reducing stress and then the perceived overall usefulness. And neuroscience would predict that. And I love it when neuroscience would go, yeah, well, we probably think this would happen. And then other research goes, yep, that's what happens. The insight without emotional resonance might alter the brain differently. It would be logical that it would alter the brain differently. So I'm taking into account lots of different data inputs when we have an interaction versus a bot. That would be different. And when there are moments of insight and you get a big dopamine hit, without that emotional resonance, you're not getting it. If I'm talking to a bot, there's no dopamine hit, there's no joy, there's nothing there. And that bit, again, it might be like the artificial sweeteners, that might be concerning. And then finally, the oversimplification of complexity. I mean, my explorations with AI is that for the really complex stuff, it misses what I would consider some really obvious things that we'd want to explore. And it's been built on what's been thought already, hasn't it? So I think there's probably a concern around that. So as with most things, yes, let's go for it, and let's give some thought to how we can wisely use it. What are your feelings?
I think same sort of, I guess, thoughts about the benefits of it in terms of eliciting practice, eliciting, building retention, recall, being able to think that through in your own context with the bot. So I've been learning about, I don't know, performance management. In my team, I have this challenge, so it gives you something to talk that through with, perhaps in a kind of scalable way. But I think it definitely shouldn't be used instead of other coaching. It's a kind of an additional tool to be used, I think, in a kind of larger context. The worry is like it's, oh, we can do coaching now with AI, you know, we can do content now with AI, so let's just do it. We can do, rather than thinking, hang on a minute, what's the right thing to do here? What's the best thing to do to help that team, those individuals, this workforce, our culture? And I think the challenge is like making sure those questions are still being asked. So I think I see huge benefits, especially through scalability. I think through scenarios that you could practice, giving you feedback that's in your context. Yeah, massively. I think there's huge benefits to that, because I think often that is missing, unfortunately, from a lot of learning pictures. Even now, there's no excuse for it, but there's often missing is the kind of practice it in my context, give me feedback based on what I've done in my context, But I think, the empathy side that you talked about is interesting, because, if I said to you, how are you doing today, Amy? And you said, I'm fine, but you said, I'm fine. I would know that you're not really fine, even though we've only just met today, I would pick up that you're not really fine and there's something to unpick there. So how well would AI do that now? I'm not, I'm not so sure. Maybe in the future it will build its senses around, emotions and being able to read things like body language better and things. But it's often what underlies a problem. What's really going on is often deeper, and it's kind of that intuition, emotional intelligence that we have, or some of us have, I think, could be missing from the picture.
And also, what you've jogged in my head is, are we doing away with human managers? Because if we are, that's one scenario. But if we're still having human managers as our predominant touch point, they're the ones that are going to be influencing our humans, and therefore our humans' brain state, and therefore our humans' ability to perform at the level that we want them to on the daily basis. So it might be all very well having an absolutely brilliant bot, but how good are our humans now at influencing our states on a daily basis?
Yeah. And I guess presumably we're not saying let's do away with managers and replace them with AI necessarily, but it's how you're developing the skills in a rounded way for the that big picture that's around you. So we know that managers can make or break great learning. So even now, without technology, let's say you did have a fantastic workshop that really did work, and it had follow-ups, and it had spaced learning, and it had practice. It might be leadership, for example. But back at work, that person's manager is not somebody who has a growth mindset. It's not somebody who asks coaching questions or supports that person. Perhaps they're very much on the doing and looking at the numbers and the data, and they don't really, bring that in. Then we know that fantastic learning probably will flop, or that person will leave and go and apply it somewhere else. So I think it's looking at the big picture, isn't it? And some of that is unknown, because we know there's going to be changes in the workforce, and we know there's going to be changes to people's job roles. So it's hard, isn't it, to predict what that future picture would look like. But right now, definitely not saying let's use this instead of the humans. It has to be in parallel, I think.
Yeah, what you've said there, I think, is really key. And one of the things that really stood out to me when we were partnered with the Wales Centre for Behaviour Change is that if you don't identify the correct or the core problem, then you can be treating, in my language, you can be treating the wrong disease. So the symptom, there are lots of ways to treat the symptom, but what's causing the symptom will have a different medicine, to medicalize it. But in these contexts, in the context many people are working in, take feedback, for example. Our feedback culture is not where we want it to be. It's a frequent request. And at first they think they're coming to us for, the neuroscience of feedback. Let's teach them in a way that excites them. We can do that. And why aren't they giving feedback to one another? Because often it's not that they don't know that they should be or know the benefits of feedback. There's often this whole host of other things going on. And I think, with the scientific hat on, it's not that easy to necessarily really identify the exact problem. Sometimes there are obvious problems, but often there's a host of things that actually are just not helping wise ways of working. So we would be much better off attending to these. Let them keep going with their, maybe mediocre awareness of giving and receiving feedback, but let's fix the bigger problems to change the behaviors of people.
Yeah, it comes back to what we were saying at the beginning, isn't it? Like it's not all about learning problems, is it? That we're looking at. It's really about the culture of workplaces, and also what the future culture might look like. And we can get all existential and big about the AI thinking, but if it's serving the capitalist productivity aims, or is it for some organizations serving a cultural, like what it means to be human, how we can work together problem, then that's kind of different. So for me, it's with anything, comes back to what are you trying to do, and what do you believe in, what values do you have, and then you can look at
Yeah,
what can support you to get there.
exactly. What can then support you to get there? Where are you trying to get to? And then how are we going to get there? And sometimes people have said, cultures, every culture is different, just it's up to you to have whatever culture you want. And I would challenge that and say, actually, you need a particular culture in order to drive particular behaviors and to get particular outcomes. So if we're thinking of something even as seemingly simple as performance, what specifically does that good performance look
Yeah.
like? Are you talking about innovation? Are you talking about critical thinking? Are you talking about something else? Because the way you then support and develop people's ability to do those things looks very different. And thinking about the future, where there will be some unknowns, there will be some general principles that probably relate to capitalizing on the uniquely humanness of your humans with the way things are going, that you really want to pay attention to.
Yeah, if you're genuinely backing the long-term vision, it's very different to serving the KPIs of today, isn't it? The key performance indicators of upping certain numbers is a very different way to look at things. So, but that's probably a whole other podcast, and maybe one where you need a glass of wine along with it, just to kind of have the deal with the negatives of the conversation too. But no, I think that's a really interesting area to look at. But so generally the point, I think we're both making is, what is it you're trying to do before you look at the technologies to help you? And AI, of course, is a magnificent tool set with lots of growth that's going to come. But ultimately, where are you trying to go, and with whom, I think, kind of comes into it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to take a little sidestep with the question just before we wrap up. So recently, I think that your book, Make Your Brain Work, came out, was it about 5 or so years ago now? How old is that book? Remind me.
The original one was almost 13
Oh,
years
okay.
ago.
So you've been doing some updates, haven't you, and been interviewing L&D leaders most recently. I wondered what sort of insights you've been gaining from that kind of struck you. Were there any surprises that came out?
There were lots of surprises. And to be honest, most of them were disappointing.
Okay.
So I first wrote it 13 years ago. It was first published. Then again 5 years ago, just before the pandemic. And then I spoke to lots of people that do different roles, L&D, senior leaders, HR, and the problems that they were sharing with me were the same problems that I was writing about 12 years ago. And even when I asked clarity questions, but what about this? What about this? Things just had not moved forward in terms of organizational design in the way that I'd anticipated. And years ago, someone in a lift said to me, I was young, I was probably I don't know, but I just presumed that things would improve much quicker. I said, we'll be out of a job in 10 years. We've created this company, we're doing this stuff, but everyone will see the sense and will be doing things differently. And he just sort of, with all his wisdom, sort of said to me, I think you'll be in business for the rest of your life. And I was really surprised, but it stuck with me, obviously. And then with these conversations, People are sharing work intensity is worse. Hybrid working just wasn't done wisely, hasn't delivered what it could have done. People are still waiting to be developed. And lots of these things, and then through our work with organisations and hearing some of the norms around how people work, even to the degree of, people that have got very cognitively demanding jobs are sort of, typing away, doing their job, and then are checking their phone, and then are going back and typing and doing the thing, then the things are pinging up, and then they're checking their phone again. And I just think, why on earth are they doing that? Like, do they want their brain to be in peak condition for this deeply cognitive, challenging work they're doing? They find that they're all burnt out and overloaded. Well, I'm not surprised doing things like that. And, teams, the impact that is having on people. And as soon as you explain the science to them, attention residue and various things to do with the cognition and their bandwidth, they're like, oh, right. Oh, yeah, no, I could do that differently. And I think we've still got a situation where a lot of people don't know, but then we've also got the situation where the load is so high and we're not helping people to strip back enough to really focus on what they need to be doing. I'm convinced lots of people want to do a great day's work, and the people that I meet are wonderful humans who want to contribute to the organisation that they're working in, but oftentimes the scaffolding's just not there. And I was at a strategy launch, a 3-day event with an amazing company that are working on decarbonising the world, and they're just brilliant in everything that they do, and they've got super smart people. So their leadership team have got multiple PhDs each, and they are super smart. And yet I gave one talk to them a couple of years ago, and a lady just said, I've realised my diary is just back to back with meetings. She's like, I'll do 30 meetings a week, and that's the norm. She says, I'm not having any time to actually spend thinking and doing the job I was actually employed for. And she did, on this particular occasion, she said, I've had 6 months coaching and that didn't occur to me. But now it has. She can take steps to make things different. But the insights I've gained are that there are a lot of things that have just not moved forward the way that that everyone thinks is wise. It's not just me that thinks that there are wiser ways of working here. So we've got to fix it. Come on.
Yeah, I feel like I need to say sorry, but it's not for me to say sorry. But I feel like I get it sometimes where, it can be the same sort of problems. But maybe something like such a big change like with AI will instigate, it will have to bring about some changes, and hopefully they are good ones. But at least might get people asking questions, we hope, to improve the way people work. We're nearly up on time. I'm going to ask you one final quick question. So based on everything you've just said, and particularly that last point about maybe some of the major problems still not being addressed in how people are at work, the kind of balance between things. If you could ask listeners to take one action today, what would you ask them to do that might be different to what they're doing now?
Co-create the solutions. Do not wait for anyone else to be solving things. We need you to co-create the solutions. Sure, learn about how your brain works so that you've got some good foundations for scaffolding these new ways of working, but everyone will be happier and contributing more engaged, more fulfilled if we have got environments where we can contribute what we're truly capable of. So get co-creating the solutions.
Amazing, thank you. And hopefully that does give people the incentives based on what they've heard today about the benefits of doing so. I want to say a massive thank you for joining us on the show. I found it absolutely fascinating, and I could keep talking to you for sure, but unfortunately we have to bring the episode to an end. So massive thank you to you, Amy.
Oh no, thank you very much.